made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
Devious and dishonest and deceitful behavior.
Prince William has filed a formal legal challenge to recover jewels that belonged to his mother, and he did it through a private law firm in London on a morning when his father was in Scotland and Camilla had no idea it was coming.
He didn't use the palace's own legal office. He didn't send a courtesy notice to Clarence House. He didn't tell Charles first. He engaged an outside firm registered in Gray's Inn, a name that appears nowhere in any official royal household documentation, and he had them enter a formal claim into the Crown Estate's registry under a reference number that looks, to anyone who doesn't already know what to search for, like routine succession administration paperwork, a claim number buried in a registry that Clarence House doesn't routinely monitor, filed on an ordinary Tuesday, filed quietly, filed without a single person inside Camilla's operation being given the chance to prepare a response before the document was already in the system. That's not a grieving son acting on impulse. That's not a family disagreement that slipped into legal territory by accident. That's a man who spent years studying the institutional machinery that was used against him and who learned, patiently and precisely, how to move inside it without triggering the early warning systems that were built to protect her. And here is where it starts to feel genuinely deliberate. In every previous instance where a matter connected to Diana's estate touched a legal mechanism, the palace's internal legal office was the first port of call. That is the procedure. The internal office manages the matter, informs all relevant households, and ensures that nothing enters an external legal record until both parties are aware. That process exists specifically because the alternative, an external filing that creates a formal legal obligation before the other side is even informed, removes the ability to quietly resolve the matter through internal channels. It removes the diplomatic option entirely. It forces a formal legal response within a defined window, on the public record, where the documentation produced in response also becomes part of that record. Using an outside firm is not how members of this family handle disputes. It is how members of this family end them. The specific document that entered the registry contains a challenge to an administrative classification decision made during the processing of Diana's estate, a decision that determined whether certain items she named in her private will fell under personal property law or crown property rules. That classification decision was made while William was still a child. It was made without his knowledge, without his guardian's formal input, and by a process that has never been publicly explained. According to people familiar with the filing, the claim does not merely request the items, it challenges the procedural legitimacy of the classification itself, which means it challenges who made that decision, through what authority, and whether the outcome was ever legally sound. A document filed quietly, a mechanism chosen specifically because it cannot be absorbed, redirected, or returned with institutional language about ongoing reviews. A move made at a moment, and in a manner, that gave Camilla's team no advance opportunity to prepare the one thing that would have neutralized it. A counterfiling made before the window closed. The silence that accompanied it was not an oversight. The silence was the point. William didn't ask for his mother's jewels back. He served notice that the agreement about who those jewels belonged to had never been as final as everyone was allowed to believe, and that the institution which protected that arrangement for over 2 decades had just been handed a formal legal document that requires it to defend the arrangement. In writing, on the record, in a venue where neither charm nor press management nor a carefully worded palace statement carries any weight whatsoever. He didn't grieve publicly. He didn't speak to the cameras. He signed a document on a Tuesday morning, and let the law do what he had apparently spent years preparing it to do. Before we go any further, if you're watching Royal Signal and haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss what comes next. There's a lot more to this story, and it's still unfolding. The whole thing actually starts with a single amended page in Diana's private will, a document quietly revised in the final months of her life, and almost nobody paid attention to it at the time. The amendment was not dramatic. It did not make headlines. It was a technical addition, the kind of language that estate lawyers include to close gaps in inheritance documentation, and it sat in a filed copy of her will for years, without anyone outside a small circle of legal professionals ever discussing it in public. The clause named a specific collection of items described only as items of personal significance and directed that they pass directly to her sons upon reaching adulthood. It was precise. It was unambiguous. And for years, the assumption the one everyone inside and outside the palace operated on was that it had been honored. The public version of events said that in the period immediately following Diana's death, her personal belongings were handled with the sensitivity and care that the gravity of the moment demanded. That appropriate items had been preserved for William and Harry as lasting mementos of their mother. That the estate had been administered properly, respectfully, and with the boys' futures in mind, which made everyone feel that the matter had been resolved quietly, privately, and in the way the family always insisted they handled anything that belonged to their interior life. No controversy, no legal dispute, no suggestion that anything had been done other than exactly what should have been done. The public version was orderly, and it held. But according to what is now coming out, during that exact same period in the weeks and months immediately following the funeral, while the nation was still in mourning, and while William and Harry were still children being shielded from the administrative reality of their mother's estate, a separate and far less visible process was underway. A determination was being made about which items in Diana's personal collection fell under personal property classification and which fell under crown property rules. That distinction is not semantic. Under personal property classification, items pass according to the terms of a private will. Under crown property classification, items belong to the institution, and the institution decides their fate. The gap between those two categories is precisely where the amended clause lived, and precisely where the amended clause was, according to William's legal filing, set aside, not challenged, not disputed through proper channels, simply classified in a direction that rendered it administratively irrelevant, without the boys' guardians being formally informed that the classification had occurred, and without any public acknowledgement that a determination had been made at all. Everyone was allowed to go on believing the estate had been handled properly, because no one announced that it hadn't been. And the person who had significant influence over how that classification was applied was not a neutral legal figure operating without personal stakes in the outcome. It was someone positioned within the household structure who stood to benefit directly from items being moved out of personal property territory and into a holding that would later fall under their own sphere of access. Someone who, in the years that followed, was seen wearing pieces from Diana's collection at formal occasions without any public explanation of the legal basis on which they were worn, and without any communication to Diana's sons about how those items had come to be in someone else's possession. Someone inside the household made the active decision to allow the classification to stand, to let the filing happen without challenge, and to permit William and Harry to grow up believing the estate had given them what their mother had specifically directed should be theirs. That decision was not an omission. It was a choice made at a moment when the people most affected by it were too young to know the question had even been asked, and made by people who understood precisely that their youth was the window of opportunity. Because if you are William and you have spent years quietly assembling the documentation, reading the amended clause your mother wrote in the final months of her life, and mapping the administrative process that was used to make that clause disappear, you are not thinking about jewelry. You are thinking about the specific decision that was made while you were a child, by specific people with specific interests, inside an institution that was supposed to be protecting you. And you are thinking about the fact that the same institution, properly approached through the right legal mechanism, is now the thing that can finally correct it. It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. The preliminary case summary was not meant to leave William's private office. It was a working document, a dense, technical outline of the legal argument his team had been constructing over several months, and it traveled inside a manila envelope marked only with an external case reference number, the kind of alphanumeric string that looks, to anyone not specifically looking for it, like routine administrative correspondence. It was placed on a desk in the household's administrative wing during a scheduling review. Not locked away, not flagged as sensitive, just set down for a few minutes on a surface that a household coordinator passed several times that morning in the ordinary course of her work. She recognized the format immediately: external legal correspondence, the specific kind that originates outside palace channels, and she saw the name at the top of the exposed first page before she looked away. She did not read further. She did not remove anything. She simply looked away, finished what she was doing, and reported it upward through the appropriate channel before the end of the day. The information reached Camilla's private secretary within 48 hours, and by the time it did, the filing was already in the registry. There was nothing left to intercept. There was only the knowledge that it had happened. She didn't hear it from Charles. She heard it from her private secretary, who came to her in the late morning and sat across from her at the desk with a single printed page, not a folder, not a briefing document, just one page which he placed in front of her without speaking. He used that careful, cold tone people use when they know their words are about to detonate. He waited until she had read through the page once, and then he said that he thought she should know before anything else came through. Her stillness lasted several seconds. Not the stillness of shock, something slower and more interior than that. The stillness of a person whose mind is moving very fast through a set of implications while her face makes the deliberate decision to give nothing away. She set the page down. She did not ask how William had managed to file without triggering the standard notification to Clarence House. She did not ask whether Charles had known. She asked one question. She asked whether the window for a counterfiling was still open. Her private secretary told her it was not. The confrontation with William did not happen in a room. It happened through a document, and through the absence of any communication attached to it, which is its own kind of confrontation, and in some ways, a more final one. But there was a conversation. It was brief. It was conducted through intermediaries, the way these things always are when the parties involved understand that a face-to-face exchange would give the other person something to work with. Her position, delivered through her office, was that the classification decision had been made correctly and through proper procedure, that it had stood without legal challenge for over 2 decades, and that William's filing was a private matter that she hoped could be resolved without further escalation. The message was institutional in tone. It offered no personal acknowledgement of what was actually at the center of the claim. William's response was not a countermessage. It was a silence, and then, through his legal team, a single clarifying statement of legal position. The jewels Diana named for her sons were never yours to keep, not delivered with anger, not framed as an accusation, stated as a fact, in legal language, as though the question of feeling had never entered the room at all. That sentence destroyed something specific, not a relationship, not a pretense of warmth that had never really existed, but a belief that the classification decision had been permanent, that the institution had protected it, and that the protection would hold because it had always held. The sentence did not say that what was done was wrong in the way that moral language says something is wrong. It said that what was done was legally vulnerable in a way that could now be formally demonstrated, which is, in its own way, a far colder thing to hear. He did not follow the statement with anything further. He did not request a meeting. He stayed at his residence and let the process move at the speed the process was designed to move, reportedly working through the evening with his legal team, a cup of tea growing cold at his elbow, his attention fixed on a document he had read many times before and continued to read as though it still had something left to tell him. He did not call after her. He stayed exactly where he was, turning pages, staring at the clause his mother had written, the one that was supposed to have protected what was his. What Camilla carried out of that exchange was not rage. Rage would have been easier to manage. What she carried was the specific, cold understanding that the administrative structure she had believed was impenetrable had just been entered through a door she hadn't known was there, by someone who had clearly known about it for a very long time. That doesn't create a wound. It reopens one far older than this dispute, far older than the marriage, older even than the years of waiting the wound of someone who has always, beneath the formal titles and the carefully managed appearances, understood that her position was built on permissions rather than foundations, that it was tolerated rather than secured. The confrontation confirmed what she had spent decades managing not to know, and what makes that dangerous is not what she will say. It is what she will now, quietly and carefully, begin to prepare. To understand what William is actually fighting for, you need to understand what Diana's jewels have already survived, because this is not the first time someone tried to determine who they belong to, and the last time this question was seriously raised. It ended a career, quietly rewrote a section of estate procedure that most royal historians don't discuss in public, and left at least one person who asked too many questions about it removed from their position before they could ask any more. This is not background. This is escalation. Because the objects at the center of William's legal filing are not decorative, they are things that people have been willing to destroy relationships over, willing to bury documentation over, and willing to make administrative decisions of questionable legality over for reasons that have nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with what these objects represent inside the institution that has fought over them, for longer than anyone currently involved has been alive. Several pieces in Diana's personal collection did not begin with Diana. They entered the Spencer family line through female inheritance across generations, passed from mother to daughter, from aunt to niece, accumulating a history of disputed ownership that stretches back well into the 19th century. At least 2 items were the subject of a formal legal dispute in the 1930s, when a distant Spencer relation attempted to redirect them away from the female line entirely, arguing that the inheritance pattern had been informal rather than legally binding, and that the items should pass through a different branch of the family altogether. That challenge was defeated in court, but only after proceedings that lasted years, drained the estate significantly, and permanently destroyed the relationship between 2 branches of a family who had, until that dispute, maintained at least the appearance of civility. One Spencer heir went to his grave having not spoken to his own cousins in over a decade, not because of anything said in anger, but because of what was said in a courtroom. On the record, about who had the right to claim what, these were not pieces people wore to charity dinners and forgot about. They were objects that had already cost a family its coherence once before, and they were still circulating, still disputed in the way that only objects with long memories can be disputed, when Diana received them. And here is where the history gets genuinely dark. In the immediate aftermath of Diana's death, at least one item from her personal collection, a brooch with a documented history in her private correspondence, specifically referenced in letters she wrote to a close friend in the early 1990s, was reportedly moved from the estate's formal inventory into a separate administrative holding, without the boy's guardians being informed that the movement had occurred. According to people familiar with the estate process at that time, this was flagged by a junior member of the legal team handling the administration. The flag was raised through the appropriate internal channel. It did not result in a review. It did not result in a formal response. It simply disappeared into a more senior level of the process and was never raised again. The junior staff member left royal service within the year. No explanation was given publicly, and none was apparently offered privately either. The brooch does not appear in any official inventory released in the years since. Its current location has never been confirmed, and the method used to move it, reclassification, administrative redirection, the quiet removal of the person who noticed, mirrors with uncomfortable precision exactly what William's legal team is now alleging happened to the items named in Diana's amended will clause. In 1837, the year Victoria came to the throne, a dispute erupted over a collection of jewels accumulated by the previous king's long-term companion during decades at court. The legal question was identical to the one William is now raising. Were these items personal gifts, and therefore hers to keep, or were they crown property that she had been permitted to wear but had never actually owned? The case was resolved not in open court but through a private settlement whose full terms have never been disclosed. Its outcome left the companion with significantly less than she had believed she possessed. She spent the remainder of her life in comfortable but deliberately reduced circumstances, never publicly acknowledging what had been taken, and never, by all accounts, fully accepting that the institution she had trusted to protect her had instead protected itself. The pattern is not new, only the names have changed. And after all of that, after a 19th century private settlement that stripped a companion of what she believed was irreversibly hers, after a 1930s court fight that tore a family apart over inheritance lines, after a flagged inventory movement in the late 1990s that ended a junior legal staffer's career before they could pursue what they had found, the question of what Diana's jewels actually are and who they legally belong to was resolved by a classification decision made during a period of national mourning, made quietly, made without announcement, made by someone who benefited from the outcome, inside an institution that has been making exactly this kind of decision, in exactly this kind of silence, for the better part of 2 centuries. Ask yourself whether William is the first person to understand what was done, and then ask yourself why he is the first person in a position to do something about it. And this legal filing didn't come from nowhere. It had been building for years, quietly, methodically, and with a patience so disciplined that the people who should have been paying attention mistook it for acceptance. The first time William encountered the wall, he was not looking for a fight. He was looking for information. Several years after Diana's estate had been formally administered and closed, when his own household was being established and the question of his inheritance arose in a routine administrative context, he submitted a written request through the appropriate palace channels asking for a formal inventory of his mother's personal jewelry collection. Not a claim, not a legal challenge. A request for documentation, the kind of transparency that any adult beneficiary of an estate would be entitled to expect as a matter of basic procedure. The request was acknowledged promptly. It was processed through the standard estate review mechanism, with the appropriate institutional language and the appropriate institutional courtesy. And it was returned with a determination that the inventory was subject to ongoing classification review and therefore not available for disclosure at the present time. No timeline was offered. No explanation was provided for why a classification review would still be active years after the estate had been formally closed. No one apologized. No one followed up. The response simply arrived, said nothing of substance, and assumed that would be the end of it. William said nothing publicly. He filed the response. And he waited. The second time, he wasn't looking for anything at all. He was reading a newspaper. A photograph had been taken at a formal royal occasion, the kind of event that generates extensive press coverage, multiple camera angles, detailed captioning, and one of the images showed a piece of jewelry being worn publicly, attributed in the accompanying coverage to personal holdings connected to Clarence House. William recognized the piece, not from memory alone, but from documentation he had by then quietly begun to assemble cross-reference descriptions, correspondence references, a paper trail that connected the item to his mother's collection in a way that the public caption did not acknowledge and the palace press office had not addressed. He had not been informed that the item was in that holding. He had not been informed that it had been moved. He discovered it the same way the public did, through photographs, not through any communication from the people who were supposed to have administered his mother's estate in his interest. He still said nothing publicly, but according to people who have worked closely with him for years, this was the moment the nature of his patience changed. Before that photograph, he had been waiting for the institution to correct itself. After it, he understood that the institution was not going to correct itself because from the institution's perspective, there was nothing to correct. The classification decision had been made. The matter had been closed, and the assumption, apparently, was that it would stay closed. The legal filing is the third data point, and this time, the scale is entirely different. Not a written request that can be returned with procedural language. Not a private recognition that can be absorbed into silence. A formal claim, in an external registry, attached to a legal mechanism that requires a formal legal response within a defined window, on a record that exists outside the palace's administrative control. The third time, except this time, every internal channel that was used to deflect and delay the first two attempts has been bypassed entirely. According to people who have worked closely with William for years, he kept a private and careful record of every single occasion where a request about his mother's estate was deflected, delayed, or redirected, including the precise channel each request traveled through, the exact language used in each response, and the specific office from which that response originated. The record is not emotional. It does not read like grief journals or private letters written in the heat of feeling. It reads, according to one source who has seen portions of it, like a case file assembled with the specific intention of eventually being handed to a legal team that would know exactly what to do with it. That kind of patient buried anger tends to be far more dangerous than anything loud, because it never fades. It only builds, and the person who finally acts on it has been thinking about exactly what to do for a very long time, has studied every procedural defense the institution might raise, has mapped every administrative channel that could be used to absorb or deflect a challenge, and has chosen a method that renders every one of those channels irrelevant before the institution even realizes the move has been made. Camilla's team is not dealing with someone acting on grief. They are dealing with someone who waited until he had built something that grief alone could never construct. A case, a record, a legal argument assembled over years, filed on a Tuesday morning, in a registry outside anyone's ability to quietly make it disappear. Some of you are probably wondering whether William can actually do this, whether a Prince of Wales can file a formal legal challenge against items held by the reigning Queen Consort without the King's prior knowledge, without internal palace coordination, and without any of the procedural courtesies that the institution normally requires before something this significant enters an external legal record. Whether the palace can simply absorb the filing, classify it as a private family matter, and make it disappear through the same internal mechanisms that have made inconvenient things disappear before. The answer, according to people with direct knowledge of both estate law and the constitutional position William occupies, is more complicated than either side would prefer, and significantly less comfortable for Clarence House than the public silence from that office currently suggests. The specific legal power William is exercising sits at the intersection of standard inheritance law and the Crown's long-established but rarely tested treatment of personal property versus royal property in the context of a sixth private estate. Under applicable legislation, items documented as personal property in a private will, as opposed to items formally classified as crown jewels, royal regalia, or institutional holdings, are subject to standard inheritance law, not royal prerogative. The Crown cannot simply absorb personal property through an administrative classification decision and then treat that decision as permanent and unchallengeable. What can be challenged, and what William's filing specifically challenges, is the procedural legitimacy of how certain items were categorized during the estate administration process. Not the ultimate question of ownership in the abstract, but the specific question of whether the classification decision was made correctly, by the right people, through the right authority, and with the appropriate notifications to those whose inheritance interests were directly affected by its outcome. Legally, William is entitled to raise that challenge. No permission slip required, no internal approval sought, no vote taken anywhere, nothing. And here is what made this filing so unusual. It was not whether he had the right. Constitutional lawyers who have examined the mechanism he used are broadly in agreement that the right exists and that he has standing to exercise it. What was unprecedented was the combination an external firm engaged without palace disclosure, a registry filing made without advance notification to Clarence House, and a silence so complete that the first indication Camilla's office received that the filing had occurred was through a third party, rather than through any formal communication from William's household. Legal matters touching on royal estates are not unprecedented. Disputes about property classification are not unprecedented, but they are invariably handled through internal mechanisms, with both parties informed before anything enters an external record, specifically because the alternative creates a formal legal obligation on the public record before the other side has had any opportunity to respond, prepare, or negotiate. William used the alternative deliberately. Decisions like this normally move through months of internal process. This happened in a single filing, on a single morning, with no advance warning to anyone inside Clarence House's legal structure. When a related matter touching Diana's estate arose through proper channels in the early 2000s, the palace coordinated across households, issued carefully worded statements, and ensured that press coverage was managed from the moment the matter became known internally. Communications were prepared, positions were aligned. The apparatus that exists to protect the institution from the consequences of its own decisions was activated well in advance of anything reaching a public record. This time, there was nothing. Just a reference number entered into a registry on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, under a filing category that would not trigger automatic notification to Clarence House, buried in a section of the administrative record where nobody responsible for protecting Camilla's position would think to look until the response window was already closing. And that silence screams louder than any press release ever could. Consider what was done in the space of a single filing. An external firm engaged outside palace visibility. A formal claim entered under estate law provisions that bypass royal administrative channels entirely. A registry notification sent to the Crown Estates Office but not to Clarence House's legal team. A mandatory response deadline embedded in the filing mechanism, requiring formal legal action within a defined window that began counting the moment the document was entered. And, according to sources familiar with the preparation behind this challenge, a secondary document already drafted and held in reserve, prepared to escalate the claim to a higher legal threshold automatically if the initial filing is dismissed on procedural grounds, closing the one exit route that Clarence House's legal team would ordinarily move toward first. Royal historians who have studied the administrative records of past reigns say they cannot identify another example of this many formal legal mechanisms shifting this quietly, this quickly, in this particular combination, without a single official announcement ever being made, confirming that any of it had happened at all. The consequences did not wait for an announcement. They began moving the moment the filing entered the registry quietly, in the specific way that consequences move inside an institution that runs on carefully managed appearances and has spent centuries learning how to absorb disruption without letting the disruption show. But this time, the absorption is not working the way it normally works, and the people closest to both households know it. The first signs were physical and immediate. Camilla missed 2 minor engagements in the days following the filing occasions she would not normally skip, the kind of low-visibility commitments that exist precisely to signal continuity and normalcy inside a household that depends on the appearance of both. Her office described them as prior commitments, offered no elaboration, and did not respond to follow-up inquiries from the press. Her private office at Clarence House, reliably staffed through morning hours under ordinary circumstances, was described by people familiar with its usual rhythms as unusually quiet across several consecutive days. An aide was seen on a Wednesday morning carrying a box of physical files to a waiting car, not a standard courier delivery, not a scheduled transfer, but an unscheduled movement of documents that broke the pattern observers of that household had come to recognize as normal. She has not appeared publicly alongside William at any engagement since the filing circulated within palace circles. And the silence between their two households, which has always been carefully managed rather than genuinely warm, has taken on a different quality in recent days. Silence inside a family built entirely on carefully managed public appearances is rarely ever just silence. It is almost always a decision being made behind closed doors, about something that cannot yet be said out loud. Behind that silence, something is being built. According to people familiar with private discussions now taking place inside the palace, Clarence House's legal team has been working through consecutive weekends to construct a formal classification defense, a document that would argue the original administrative determination made during Diana's estate. Administration was both procedurally correct and legally binding, and that the passage of time since that determination was made strengthens rather than weakens its standing. The challenge they face is not primarily legal. It is documentary. The same mechanism William used to file his claim also entitles his legal team to formally request the underlying documentation that supported the original classification decision, the specific records, the specific authority cited, the specific notifications made or not made to those whose inheritance interests were affected. If the case proceeds past the initial response stage, that documentation enters the legal record, which means the process by which those items were categorized, who participated in making that determination, what authority they cited, and who was informed and who was not, stops being a private institutional matter and becomes something that exists on a public record that neither household controls. That is what Clarence House is most urgently, most quietly concerned about right now. Not the items themselves, the paper trail attached to how the items were moved. At least one senior legal figure close to the household has reportedly raised a possibility dark enough that the people who heard it described the room going very still when it was said, if the classification defense fails, if an independent legal authority determines that the original administrative decision did not correctly apply estate law, or that the notifications required to make it binding were not properly made, the legal implications do not stop at the specific items named in William's filing. A successful challenge to the classification process itself calls into question every classification decision made about Diana's personal property during that same administrative period, which means this case, if it reaches that threshold, is not about a collection of jewels at all. It is about the legitimacy of the entire administrative process used to manage Diana's estate in the months after her death, while her sons were children, while the nation was in mourning, and while the people making those decisions understood that no one was in a position to scrutinize them. Nothing this legally foundational has ever been attempted this quietly, with this much preparation behind it, which means everything William has just set in motion might not be the end of this war at all. It might only be the opening shot. There is a formal royal engagement in 6 weeks, a ceremonial occasion of the kind where protocol is visible, where appearances carry institutional meaning, and where the question of what is worn, and by whom, and under what legal basis, cannot be managed through a press statement or resolved with careful seating arrangements. Palace staff have quietly begun using language normally reserved for occasions requiring extraordinary levels of advanced coordination. Enhanced logistical preparations are being made for an event that would not, under ordinary circumstances, require them. Nobody has explained why. Nobody has denied that the preparations are unusual. Ask yourself why that level of preparation would be considered necessary for an occasion that should, by every institutional precedent, be entirely routine. And then ask yourself why so many people close to this family, in both households, believe they already know exactly what is coming, and why none of them are saying it out loud. There was a moment, according to a source familiar with the household, that has stayed with everyone who heard about it. Camilla was standing at a window inside Clarence's house, not looking for anything in particular, not waiting for anyone to arrive, when a car she recognized as connected to William's private legal operation pulled slowly through the street below and disappeared around a corner. She did not reach for her phone. She did not call her private secretary. She did not move toward the door or away from the glass. She simply stood there, one hand resting against the edge of the curtain, watching the space where the car had been understanding, in the specific way people understand things they have been quietly dreading for a long time, that the process she had believed was permanently closed had been reopened by someone who spent years preparing to reopen it, that there was no communication she could send now that would change what was already in the registry, no internal mechanism she could activate that would absorb what had already bypassed every internal mechanism, no version of the next conversation with Charles that would return the situation to what it had been before a Tuesday morning, made it permanently into something else. She did not speak. She did not move away from the window. She merely stood there, watching a street that was now empty, with the specific stillness of someone who has just understood that the thing they spent years believing was safely behind them has been in front of them the entire time. The real question was never whether William could win a legal case about jewelry. It was always whether the administrative structure used to manage Diana's estate in the months after her death was ever built to withstand genuine legal scrutiny, or whether it was constructed in the quiet confidence that no one, with both the standing and the will to challenge it, would ever actually do so. Whether the institution that protected those decisions for over 2 decades is still capable of protecting them now, against someone who has been reading the same amended clause in his mother's private will for the better part of his adult life, and whether the people who made those decisions, in that window of mourning and administrative opacity, ever genuinely believed that the child who was too young to know the question was being asked would one day be a man who knew exactly how to ask it in a language the institution could not ignore. History doesn't usually announce itself with a press release. It arrives in a reference number buried in a Crown Estates registry on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, filed by someone who spent years watching an institution protect the people who moved against his mother and who finally decided that the same institution, properly approached through the right mechanism, could be made to answer for what it protected. What comes next will not be managed from a press office. It will not arrive with a statement or a coordinated communication, or any of the careful language this family has spent generations using to make difficult things sound like they were never difficult at all. It will simply arrive, the way these things always do, in the silence that falls right before something that cannot be.